Denzel Washington had built his reputation over decades as one of the most respected figures in Hollywood, admired not just for his acting but also for his measured words and quiet wisdom. He wasn't the kind of man who spoke carelessly, and when he did share his perspective, people listened because they knew he meant every word. That's why the moment caught everyone by surprise. The cameras were rolling, the lights were steady, and the atmosphere seemed like any other late-night talk show appearance. But Denzel's expression hinted that this conversation was about to go somewhere no one expected. The host had asked him a light-hearted question about the difference between truth in film and truth in real life, perhaps expecting a witty remark about the entertainment industry. Instead, Denzel leaned forward, clasped his hands, and with the same calm tone he often carried in his roles, he began to share something startling. He said, "You know, sometimes truth isn't just a matter of perspective. Sometimes it's written into who we are, written into us at the most basic level. I've seen things that prove this in ways you wouldn't believe." His eyes didn't wander toward the audience or the camera, they stayed fixed on the host, as if to emphasize the seriousness of what he was about to reveal. Then came the shift that froze the room. With deliberate precision, he mentioned Donald Trump's name. "I've seen DNA results connected to Trump," he said softly but firmly. The air seemed to thicken in the studio. People weren't sure if they'd heard him right. This wasn't a political jab, not an opinionated comment, it was something scientific, something grounded in fact. Denzel stressed that he wasn't there to speculate or to fuel gossip, but that the documents he had witnessed were as real as anything he had ever held. The host blinked rapidly, clearly unprepared for where the conversation had turned. The producers off-camera leaned closer, whispering to each other, unsure whether to signal for a commercial or let him continue. Yet Denzel pressed forward. "This isn't about who you vote for, it isn't about liking or disliking someone," he explained. "This is about identity, about the most basic code that makes us who we are. And when I say I've seen these results, I mean I've seen them with my own eyes." His words didn't carry the flourish of performance, they were steady, controlled, and precise. He explained that what he had witnessed wasn't just a sheet of numbers or graphs but a full report that raised questions no one had dared to ask openly. He described it as containing anomalies, details that challenged the public understanding of Trump's lineage, his background, and even certain official records. Denzel was careful not to go too deep, but the implication was strong enough to cause a ripple of unease throughout the audience. People in the crowd shifted in their seats, some frowning, others leaning forward, trying to catch every syllable. In that moment, the audience realized they weren't hearing an actor delivering lines or weaving a story, they were hearing a man recount something personal and unsettling. Denzel's voice didn't rise, but his words carried weight, and that made them even more striking. He reminded the host again that what he was saying wasn't speculation. "I know how crazy this sounds," he admitted, "but facts don't need approval to exist." His tone carried no arrogance, only certainty. The host attempted to lighten the mood with a nervous chuckle, but it didn't land. Denzel didn't smile. Instead, he paused just long enough to let the tension hang in the air before continuing, "This is the kind of information that changes how people see someone. And once it's out there, you can't put it back." The words struck like a quiet thunderclap, understated but impossible to ignore. In those few sentences, Denzel Washington had shifted the entire energy of the broadcast. He hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't dramatized the revelation, but his calm demeanor made it even more shocking. Here was a man who rarely ventured into sensational topics, suddenly saying he had seen DNA evidence connected to Donald Trump, something that suggested more than just ancestry, something that hinted at hidden truths buried beneath layers of secrecy. The host, visibly unsettled, tried to steer the topic elsewhere, but the audience knew the night had already changed. Denzel had dropped a revelation that would ripple far beyond that studio, and his presence, his reputation, made it impossible for anyone to simply dismiss. What he said about Trump's DNA wasn't just a headline, it was a crack in the surface of a larger, unseen story. The seconds that followed after Denzel Washington's initial revelation felt like they moved in slow motion, though in reality less than a minute had passed. It was during this short window, just 47 seconds, that the atmosphere shifted from curiosity to disbelief. Denzel, still leaning slightly forward in his chair, seemed aware of how unusual his words sounded, yet he pressed on as though he couldn't let the moment pass without saying what needed to be said. His voice carried a calm urgency, the kind of tone that told the audience he wasn't embellishing for effect. He began by clarifying that the DNA results he had seen weren't just random lab reports but were tied to a series of classified documents. He didn't name who had shown them to him, but he hinted that the material wasn't supposed to be in the public eye. It's not just a matter of what the results said, Denzel explained carefully, but who had them, and why they were being kept away from people. That one line drew an audible gasp from a few in the studio audience. Suddenly, this wasn't just about science, it was about secrecy, about deliberate withholding of information. The host, visibly uncomfortable, attempted to interject with a nervous laugh, asking, "You mean like ancestry stuff, or, what exactly?" But Denzel didn't smile. He looked the host directly in the eyes and said, "It's deeper than ancestry. These results weren't being hidden because of curiosity, they were hidden because of what they connect back to." His voice slowed slightly, each word deliberate. There was no room to misinterpret him. Those watching could feel the tension climb. It was no longer just a casual interview, it had become a revelation unfolding in real time. Denzel spoke about how the documents contained references that linked Trump's DNA to archives that were sealed decades ago, files that shouldn't have had his name in them at all. He didn't go into specific details, but the way he described it made clear that the implications reached far beyond what anyone in the room was prepared for. His words painted a picture of something that was supposed to stay buried, yet here he was, hinting at it on live television. For a man known for his thoughtful pauses and unshakable composure, there was an edge in his delivery that night. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't showmanship, it was a quiet weight. He knew that every second he spoke was pushing a boundary, but he couldn't seem to stop himself. The 47 seconds became a blur of carefully chosen phrases that carried enormous weight. "The thing about truth," Denzel said, "is that it doesn't need your permission. It exists whether you want it to or not. And once you see it, you can't unsee it." The host glanced nervously toward the producers, clearly hoping someone would signal for a break, but the cameras kept rolling. The audience inside the studio leaned forward in silence, waiting for more, each second more uncomfortable than the last. Denzel added that what unsettled him most wasn't just the existence of the results, but the effort being made to bury them. "If this were harmless, if it didn't matter," he said slowly, "then why go through so much trouble to make sure no one ever sees it?" Those words hit harder than anything else he had said. They suggested intent, an organized effort to suppress information that could alter how people understood one of the most polarizing figures in modern history. In less than a minute, Denzel Washington had drawn a direct line between hidden science, political secrecy, and the fragile trust the public places in what they're told. The moment felt raw and unscripted, the kind of thing that doesn't happen on polished television sets. For decades, Denzel had been known as a man who chose his words carefully, someone who rarely let himself be pulled into controversy. But here, within 47 seconds, he had done something no one anticipated. He had pointed toward a hidden truth involving Donald Trump, hinting at DNA records and sealed documents, and left everyone in the room unsure of what they had just witnessed. What made it even more jarring was how ordinary the setup had been. There had been no heated debate, no combative back and forth, just Denzel speaking in the same calm, deliberate manner that audiences had admired for years. And yet the content of his words was anything but ordinary. It was explosive in its implications, unsettling in its tone, and unforgettable in its delivery. The weight of those 47 seconds didn't disappear when the cameras eventually cut away. They lingered in the air, seeping into the minds of those who had been in the studio and those who would later watch the clip online. Denzel Washington had spoken with such conviction that even those who doubted the content couldn't ignore the sincerity. In less than a minute, he had shifted the narrative from curiosity about truth and storytelling to a shocking revelation about Trump's DNA, something no one had seen coming, and something that couldn't be erased once it was out. The studio was already holding its breath when Denzel Washington's words suddenly faltered. He had been speaking with clarity, steady and composed, but then his voice caught as though a thought hit him mid-sentence that made him reconsider everything. For the first time that night, his confidence slipped, and it was visible to everyone. He looked off camera, his eyes searching toward the shadows where the producers and crew stood. The silence stretched just a little too long. And then, breaking the rhythm of the interview entirely, Denzel said the words no one expected, "Can we cut the cameras?" The host's eyes widened, unsure if this was a joke, a dramatic pause, or a real request. Denzel wasn't smiling, wasn't playing with the moment, he was serious. His usually composed face carried something uncharacteristic, discomfort. It was rare to see him unsettled, even in the most intense roles he played, and yet here he was, live on television, asking for the cameras to stop rolling. The crew hesitated. There was no button they could press to erase what had already been said, but his urgency made them nervous. He leaned back slightly, almost as if he regretted going as far as he had. His hand brushed against his chin, his eyes downward, as though calculating the consequences of his last few sentences. "This isn't the kind of thing you should just say out loud," he muttered softly, though the microphone still picked it up. That one line only amplified the shock. Viewers at home heard it clearly, and the live audience reacted with a low ripple of whispers. If he had simply dropped a surprising comment earlier, this was different. It was a rare glimpse of someone trying to pull back from a line they realized they shouldn't have crossed. The host attempted to keep the show moving, fumbling for a lighter topic, but Denzel wasn't fully listening. His attention kept drifting toward the off-camera crew. His body language said everything. Shoulders tense, eyes darting, a man weighing the balance between truth and risk. "I don't think people understand how serious this is," he finally said, almost as though he were speaking to himself. His tone had changed, it was quieter, edged with hesitation, but still carrying the weight of conviction. The crew, unsure of how to handle the moment, began gesturing quietly among themselves. But nothing could undo the fact that Denzel had asked to stop filming, a move so unusual for a guest of his stature that it immediately became the most shocking part of the night. For a man of discipline, someone who built his career on control and presence, that sudden break of composure spoke louder than anything else. It wasn't theatrics. It wasn't acting. It was the raw response of someone who had said more than they intended and wanted desperately to shut the door before more slipped out. The audience, sensing the gravity, remained frozen. Normally a break in conversation might spark laughter or applause, but not this time. Everyone understood instinctively that this wasn't staged. This was Denzel Washington, a man known for being careful with his words, suddenly asking for silence, asking for privacy in a place designed for exposure. The contrast was almost too surreal. Trump's name still hung in the air, the earlier reference to DNA results looping in people's minds. Now, with Denzel trying to cut the conversation short, it gave the impression that what he had seen and nearly revealed in full was far more dangerous than he initially let on. His reluctance only made the revelation more powerful. If he was truly making something up, why try so hard to stop the cameras? Why suddenly want the world to unhear what had already been said? The attempt to withdraw became proof in itself that the subject carried real weight. He looked back at the host, who had gone uncharacteristically quiet, then leaned closer and said softly, "Some things you don't say in public. Not like this." Again, the microphone carried every syllable. The producers finally signaled, and the broadcast was abruptly sent to a commercial break, leaving the audience in a state of shock. The cut only amplified the mystery. People watching at home instantly realized that something had been said that wasn't meant to be, and now it had been interrupted in the most abrupt way possible. When the show returned, the mood was entirely different. The host smiled nervously and shifted to talking about Denzel's latest film project, but the moment had already branded itself into everyone's memory. Denzel himself played along, answering questions politely, but the earlier request to stop the cameras lingered in the minds of everyone who saw it. The contrast between his usual polished demeanor and that single, unguarded moment told the world that what had come out wasn't a rehearsed stunt, it was something real. For days afterward, clips of him saying, "Can we cut the cameras?" circulated endlessly. People slowed the footage down, analyzed his expression, and argued about why a man like Denzel Washington would break composure in such a striking way. That 47-second stretch had already been enough to shock audiences, but his abrupt plea to end the broadcast pushed the story into an entirely new realm. The controlled, composed actor had cracked open just long enough to let everyone see the weight of what he was holding, and it was tied to Donald Trump in a way no one was prepared for. The moment the broadcast cut away from Denzel Washington's plea to stop the cameras, the damage, or perhaps the impact, was already irreversible. In an age where everything could be clipped, replayed, and dissected within seconds, the 47-second stretch had already started its journey across the internet. By the time the show returned from its sudden commercial break, social media feeds were already buzzing with speculation. People were typing furiously, posting shaky phone recordings taken directly from their televisions, and asking the same question: what had Denzel just revealed about Donald Trump? The producers may have hoped the break would diffuse the tension, but it had the opposite effect. Viewers at home immediately recognized that something unusual had happened. A guest of Denzel's stature didn't just ask to cut cameras unless the stakes were serious. His calm yet urgent tone lingered in people's minds, replayed in clips that spread like wildfire. Within hours, the phrase "cut the cameras" was trending worldwide, attached to countless theories about what exactly he had seen in those DNA results he mentioned. The online world divided almost instantly. Some dismissed it as a slip of the tongue, suggesting that perhaps Denzel had been referencing something unrelated to Trump but that the conversation had spiraled into misunderstanding. Others, however, weren't willing to downplay it. They pointed to the way his body language shifted, the uncharacteristic discomfort in his voice, and the way he stared off camera at the producers as proof that he had touched on something far more serious than he intended. "Denzel doesn't break character," one post read. "If he said something like this and then begged to stop the cameras, it means it was real." Clips of him saying "I've seen DNA results connected to Trump" were spliced with footage of his abrupt request to cut the broadcast. Each replay only intensified the mystery. Online commentators, podcasters, and independent journalists analyzed his words frame by frame, breaking down every gesture and pause. They questioned why a man who had avoided sensationalism his entire career would suddenly risk everything to make a statement like that. His reputation for being thoughtful and private became the very reason people took his words seriously. Denzel wasn't known for stirring controversy, he was known for discipline and restraint. That made the revelation all the more haunting. In discussion threads and video commentaries, people began speculating about the sealed documents he hinted at. Some claimed it could tie to Trump's family history, others suggested it was related to legal battles, and a few insisted it connected to matters much larger than politics. The absence of details fueled the frenzy. Because Denzel had cut himself off before elaborating, people filled the silence with their own theories. Each one sounded more dramatic than the last, yet the uncertainty kept people glued to the clip, debating endlessly over what the truth might be. News outlets couldn't ignore it either. The morning after the interview, major headlines ran with variations of the story: Denzel Washington drops bombshell on live TV, actor requests cameras be cut after Trump DNA remark, and 47 seconds that shook viewers. Pundits argued about whether his statement had any factual basis, while others pointed out how quickly the producers had scrambled to end the conversation. The attempt to downplay it seemed only to strengthen the idea that something was being hidden. Denzel himself remained silent in the days that followed, which only heightened the intrigue. He didn't release a statement, didn't clarify his words, didn't try to explain himself. That silence was interpreted by many as confirmation that what he had said was too big to walk back. Some argued that he had been warned not to speak further, while others thought he was choosing caution after realizing how far the revelation had spread. His absence from the conversation kept the speculation alive, because the man who started it all wasn't there to close the loop. For Donald Trump, the clip added another layer to his already controversial public image. Supporters brushed it off as an overblown comment, while critics latched onto it as evidence that there were still secrets surrounding him. The viral moment gave fresh life to debates that had been quiet for months, sparking a new wave of arguments about truth, secrecy, and power. What made the aftermath unforgettable was the way ordinary people treated those 47 seconds. For many, it wasn't about whether Denzel was right or wrong, it was about the way he said it. His calm tone, the sudden crack in his composure, and his plea to stop the cameras gave the moment a raw authenticity that no one could ignore. It didn't feel like a scripted stunt, it felt like a slip of truth that wasn't meant to reach the public. And once it did, there was no way to take it back. The clip became one of the most replayed moments of the year, analyzed across platforms and replayed millions of times. Each viewing sparked the same uneasy feeling that Denzel Washington, a man trusted for his sincerity, had revealed something about Donald Trump that was never supposed to be said aloud. And the silence that followed from him only deepened the shock, leaving people to wonder if the truth he carried was simply too heavy to share in full. In the days and weeks that followed, the weight of Denzel Washington's words refused to fade. What had been meant as just another televised conversation turned into a moment that blurred the line between entertainment and revelation. His calm mention of DNA, his insistence that he had seen results tied to Donald Trump, and his abrupt plea to cut the cameras carved themselves into public memory. It wasn't just what he said, but how he said it, measured, steady, and with the authority of a man who had built his life and career on credibility. For many, that was enough to believe something extraordinary had slipped out. The conversation became more than gossip or a viral clip, it became a symbol of how fragile the truth can be when it brushes against power. Denzel's choice of words, his hesitation, and his sudden awareness that he may have gone too far resonated with audiences in a way that few televised moments ever do. People began to ask themselves uncomfortable questions. How much information is withheld from the public? How often do figures of influence stumble upon truths that never reach ordinary citizens? And why would someone as cautious as Denzel risk even a hint of such a claim unless he was absolutely certain of what he had seen? In private circles, analysts and commentators tried to piece together the meaning of his statements. They argued that his silence afterward said more than any clarification could. By refusing to retract, deny, or expand, Denzel left the world suspended in uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, speculation thrived. Some said his words would be forgotten in time, buried beneath the constant churn of news. But others insisted that those 47 seconds would endure precisely because they raised questions that couldn't be answered. The host of the program later admitted in a subtle interview that he, too, had never seen Denzel so shaken. You could tell it wasn't a performance, he confessed. He realized mid-sentence that he shouldn't be saying it, and that was when he asked to stop. That admission only cemented the authenticity of the moment. For Donald Trump, the clip became another thread in the endless fabric of debate that surrounded him. His supporters dismissed it as irrelevant, while his critics pointed to it as another shadow in a long list of mysteries. But no matter the stance, the fact remained that Denzel Washington, an unlikely figure to court controversy, had brought Trump's name and DNA into the same sentence on live television. And that alone was enough to make people stop and think. In the end, the story wasn't about politics alone, nor about science, nor even about Denzel himself. It was about the raw, human moment when truth seemed to slip out before someone could stop it. It was about the vulnerability of a man realizing he had crossed into dangerous territory, and the world catching that realization in real time. The cameras did eventually cut, but the questions never did. And perhaps that was the true legacy of those 47 seconds, not answers, but the lingering weight of uncertainty that left millions wondering what Denzel Washington had really seen, and why he felt the world wasn't ready to hear the rest.